Hello world! Patricia O'Connor and Frida Reba Darcy is in the house. I hope I'm not. I hope the music's getting too loud. And tonight, it's dusk. It's dusk. Beautiful, beautiful day in Alameda, California. I'm Patricia O'Connor, and by my side is Frida Reba Darcy. We are the Bonsai Balcony, and I brought my cup of coffee. This is gonna take a minute. This is gonna take a minute. Get your beverage ready. Tonight's show is going to be. I'm saying tonight. 7 o'clock here. This evening's show is going to be about soil. Soil. There's a lot of myths. We're going to dispel maybe a couple of myths. We're going to try to add a little clarity to the situation. Sometimes, when we're getting into bonsai, we have ideas, and some of these ideas are based on things that we've done before, experiences we've had in the past, or we're learning about bonsai and we're watching videos and we're having people tell us to do things, and maybe based on those things we might make a mistake or two or get a misconception. I filled this very, very, very large pot full of akadama and planted these 3 cypress trees in it, when what I should have done was gotten big old huge chunky rocky things and planted these trees in that, because we had a lot of lumber to make. And what I had been hearing was that fine akadama makes fine roots, and fine roots are so desirable, blah blah blah. So fine roots are desirable, that's not a lie. But when it comes time to make fine roots, whenever you're making wrapping around and growing big parts of a tree, for instance, it's not necessarily the time for fine roots. That's the time for big roots, which makes big pieces of lumber, which helps you grow the tree that you chopped or hacked or done. That's not soil. Tonight we are going to talk about soil. A lot of times, say, like the mistake I make with the akadama. Maybe we get a tree from a nursery, or maybe with the holidays coming up, maybe we bring home a little Christmas tree or something, and we think to ourselves, this is, this bonsai tree, this is going to be the greatest bonsai tree ever. So we go to the nursery and we buy premium potting soil, for instance. That's not necessarily the way to go. And on the other hand, you watch videos and they're always talking about on bonsai trees, and they're always talking about akadama. What is akadama, and what is soil, and what is potting soil, and why is it that I'm getting results that don't quite line up with my expectations? And we're going to try to add some clarity to all of that stuff. For starters, some generations back, if you saw somebody with a lot of plants on their balcony or their patio, their front patio, their back patio, their back porch, their front porch, or in planters out in their yard, they would maybe they would have invested a little bit in soil. And the difference between then and now, a couple of generations backwards talking, is that would have lasted. Grandmother would take a pot that was this big and weighed as much as a pot with cement in it. It weighed a lot, okay? And maybe the plant will have been in there for 10 years. And then when she unpots it, boom, and she takes all the soil loose, and she would cut back the roots. And it was a custom then that I still see people do some version of that today. She would take pieces of broken pottery and throw down in the bottom of the pot in order to try to increase drainage, to make sure that the dirt didn't just plug up the whole time. I don't know how effective that was, but that's we would all do it. We would take busted pieces of pottery and throw down there in the bottom of the pot, and that was supposed to keep drainage going. So, having chopped back the roots, we would have a big pile of substrate, of soil, that just came out of this pot. And what are we going to do with that? We'll rake some of it back into the pot, and then we're going to set the plant back in the pot, and then we're going to rake the rest of it back in the pot, because it was different soil than what we call potting soil today. It was a completely different mix. It was heavier, and it was for life. So what was the difference? Potting soil, when you go to a nursery today and you buy a bag of potting soil, one, it's very lightweight. It's not heavy the way I was saying grandmother's potted up tub of cement weighed. But the difference being is a bag of potting mix today, premium potting mix, is mostly dead material. It's mulch. Now, whereas what we used generations ago would have been soil. Now, if you like go take a shovel, stick it down in the ground, turn that over, and look at it, that is soil. What is that? That is mostly quartz, or ground up quartz, which is sand, or ground up fine sand, which is silt, or silt combined with the local ore, iron, copper, whatever mineral, and you get clay. Iron would be red clay or brown clay. Some of the unglazed pots that we use, I think that's an example of iron rich, but also red clay would be iron rich. Copper would, I think, produces yellow and green clay. Akadama that we like to use is the yellow clay, and it comes from a specific region in Japan, where I think they're carving it out of the mountain somewhere. Incidentally, side note, Ryan Neil with Bonsai Mirai sent some akadama, Japanese red ball akadama, to the U.S. Agriculture Department or geological, anyway. He sent it up to the people who knew about elements and rocks and geological. Thank you, Pat. And the word came back that that form of clay was found 2 places in the world, and they named the region in Japan where everybody mines that from. And then the second place, oddly enough, was in the United States, and it was Mount Hood. So yeah, which is just a little side note. But what is akadama? That's clay. And when I think of akadama, and we use akadama in bonsai, and some bonsai people who like to use akadama use it straight. Some people like to mix it with other things like lava rock or pumice. Pumice is lava rock that has been heated and spun in the same way that if you take sugar, heat it and spin it, you get cotton candy. You take lava, you heat it and spin it, you get pumice. So that's the white stuff. And if you take pumice and lava rock, again, little black chunks of lava rock, and akadama, third, that is a pretty common bonsai mix. The advantages of that are, if you just took soil, just scooped up some dirt in your hand, like from a field somewhere, and then added water to that, you've got mud. If you take akadama and add water to that, you've still got hard clay pellets that have to be broken down through force. And if you were to take one, to me, they are about the same size and consistency. I don't know how well this is going to relate. Everybody can relate to this, but like a broken windshield makes those little sides and cubes of about the same size. And if you were to take one of those little cubes of akadama and look at it under a microscope, you would see that it is. You would see that it's full of. That it has holes, and it has holes like a sponge or Swiss cheese. And if you were to magnify it more, you would see that there are more holes. And then if you were to see tiny little holes and magnify them, you would see those as big, but then you would see smaller ones. Just keep going right on down, and there's going to be little holes in this little clay pellet. But just because it's wet doesn't mean it breaks down. It stays hard. But whenever we water, the water goes through our bonsai pot, and it pours all the way through. And what we want is we don't want it to turn our soil into mud and linger and fester and just lay there oxygenless. What we want is we want the water to go through into the top and go through the pot, and as it goes through the pot, it draws in oxygen behind it. And if we have our trees planted in some mixed with akadama, the akadama, being clay, will soak up the water, but will also let the bulk of the water pass through. And the chunks of the spaces in between the akadama, between the lava, between the pumice, allow for air. And that air and water exchange is what makes for healthy trees. Now those holes are important. If a root is laying next to pieces of akadama, and the root is laying next, and as that akadama dries out, that root will send out microscopic little shoots that will take advantage of these tiny holes. It'll find one of those and exploit it and send that tiny little root in that hole to exploit that little drop of water that will be hiding, that will be resting in there. And as it does, it swells up, and as it swells up, it breaks the akadama in half, and which still works. That's how akadama gets broken down, and that's how akadama helps us to make fine roots on trees. But it also helps us to exchange the air and the oxygen, because it stays contained as a little chunk of clay, even as it's getting broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. And as it gets smaller and smaller pieces, it takes finer and finer roots to be able to exploit that little hole trick that they were using. So that's kind of what akadama does in a potting mix. What does lava do in a potting mix? Lava rocks, the little black lava rocks, they do soak up a small amount of water, and they do pass that onto the tree. But the roots can't exploit those holes and grow inside of them and break them down the way it can the akadama. But those roots will still exploit those little Swiss cheese hole in the lava that also contains traces of water, while at the same time those will be replaced by spaces of air, so that they also kind of, in that way, they also aid in the exchange of water and oxygen. Pumice is really good. It's less about pumice is less about the oxygen and more about water retention. That is just a great. It's good for water retention, and that's why it's sort of the third. Quite often, it's the third ingredient. So that's just kind of a quick breakdown of what we do in bonsai. But this is also a quick little breakdown of what we did in past. What we would do in the past was use something that was the reason that soil would last so long is it was sand, and sand doesn't get torn down by roots. So that's why your grandmother would take that soil, break the roots out of it, have this big pile of soil here, cut those roots back, trim those roots back so that they can flourish again and have room to grow. And then all of the microbial activity that had been invested between that soil and that plant will be allowed to continue, because she's going to take that soil and put it right back in there. It's not breaking down in the same way. She would fertilize, whether she fertilized daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, twice yearly, whatever. All of that is a part of that. That's aside the fact, but what she would have is soil that would last a long time, and that the plant would thrive in for a long time. And whenever it started getting too tight in there, she would uproot it, cut the roots back, throw that soil back in, put that tree back in there, put that plant back in there, put that, whatever back in there, feed it as needed, water it as needed, and continue. And that's how plants thrive for years. Now, potting soil that we get from nurseries, or that we get from the garden center, wherever we have our garden center. As I said earlier, that's mostly mulch. And what is mulch? Mostly dead material. Some soil, but not a lot. What it will be big on is a lot of times they amend that with fertilizer. A lot of times it has a lot of microbes in it, which aids in the plant's ability to break down nutrients. Very, very few plants take fertilizer from the fertilizer into the tree. Very, very few. When I was taught this, the person that was teaching us brought up broccoli as being one of the few things that can actually take fertilizer like right out of the bottle. Everything else needs a host, needs a symbiotic relationship with something else, some kind of bioorganism that takes the nutrients, the fertilizer that we're giving it, it breaks that down and it eats it and it thrives. But also they take these nutrients and that causes them to have like the soil equivalent to an algae bloom. In a matter of hours, their population can just quadruple, and they're having a high old time off of everything, and they live and they die super fast. And once they're gone, the plant takes them up. So when you're using potting soil, it's mostly dead matter, and that would be a little bit like your compost garden, except that they're not using compost. Most of the time these commercial people are going to lumber yards and getting the stuff that's shredded off of trees off of the logs before they go into the process, and then they shred that stuff up. They shred that up, right? And then maybe they add some chemical, not, maybe they add some nutrients to that. I know that I used to be a big fan of something called fox form, and it had a smell to it that you could actually smell in the things that grew in it. And it was this shredded material, but you were paying extra because it had, at the time, I don't know what the ingredients are now, but at the time when I was using it, it also had mostly kelp, sea kelp, and crab emulsion. You know, like they were going to like fish refineries and stuff, and they were taking all of their leftovers and running that through. And it had, you know, all of this stuff would make beautiful, fantastic plants in the short term. If you wanted fantastic, ripe, beautiful tomatoes, then this is all going to happen, come and go within 8 months. Anything after that, and your potting soil is begin to break down, because that was all mostly dead matter, not the silicon-based, that the quartz-based, sand-based soil of the past. The advantages to this stuff is, like we said earlier, it's lightweight, and they usually fill it full of supplements, and they usually fill it full of microbes. But once those guys are gone, you can kind of revitalize that soil once or twice with your own fertilizer and stuff. But just like that plant in the office, it stops taking up water. You kind of notice that the soil is starting to shrink a little bit. So maybe you subsidize that, but it doesn't really help the look of the soil. The soil just kind of has this, you don't really know, but it doesn't look right. It just doesn't look right. But what you're noticing is that it's gone septic. Everything that was going to live and thrive has lived, thrived, and died. And now what you have is the leftovers. And as long as the plant can eat what is breaking down, it will, and it'll grow off that. But the pH is getting farther and farther off. pH isn't something you have to know everything in the world about. Just know that at some point that roots are starting to lay in things that have been decaying long enough, and there's not enough other things like sand or rocks or something in there that's forever, then this is starting to become a pH unbalanced toxic mess. And that's why you couldn't save that office tree. And that's why whenever you have a plant and all of a sudden it just looks like it's starting to take up water, stops taking up water, and it still has its leaves, but it stops taking up water. So you start to wait. You know, you think, well, I've just been told that if we overwater it, just to wait until it dries out before we water it again. So you sit back and you wait, and you're watering everything else but this thing, and you keep waiting, and you're going, this is taking too long, and the tree just kind of starts to look kind of yellow and funny and pale, but it still doesn't seem to take up water. You know, it's still wet. Why am I watering everything else and this is still not not dry, and it's starting to look like it's not being watered. So finally you break down and water it, so at least you're not, at least you're, you're not going crazy here. Later, when the tree dies, you take it back to the gardener and they go, yeah, you overwatered it. The soil turned to toxic mess. And that's what the microbes that we were talking about that lived and flourished, whenever they're gone, you're left with an ever shrinking, and you will see it shrinking in the pot, to raise up the root ball and to add soil to the bottom of it, which would have been my first go-to when I would go, that plant ate that soil and now it's out of soil. I must add more soil. So if I lifted up the root ball and threw more of that same stuff and then set it down, the plant is still in a toxic mess. I've just given it some fresh soil at the bottom to munch on, which may or may not help. It may not even respond to that. So that's kind of what's going on there. I would probably, and most people aren't aware of this, because in most places in the world, we buy plants based on the color they add to the outside of our home, and come winter, that's a bad issue anyway. Or if they were perennials, doesn't matter, they're going to be gone in winter anyway, but that ficus and those other things that we're trying to keep and stuff, and all of a sudden we start having these issues. Why won't it take up the water? Why is it starting to look bad? Why is this soil look like it's the top? Why do I have white flies all of a sudden, and why can't I water this tree ever and to make it look healthy? And why, that's what's going on there. And it's because you have something that's more of a permanent plant than the soil that it's sitting in. And that's pretty much my TED talk on potting mixes and soil. I'm just gonna do a little, we'll go this way. A little drawing of a little cube here. And this, our little cube is a block of akadama, and it'll have kind of like these little, you'll see those larger, those dots on my cube represent the holes inside of akadama. But then there's also going to be little fine holes in there too. And if you were to magnify those little fine holes up to where they look as big as these, you would see farther down the rabbit hole if there's ever increasing more. And it's these little holes that our roots exploit with these tiny little microscopic hairs. Most of the nutrients that get taken up, most of the water that gets taken up by the new growth roots. Those microscopic little hairs do most of the heavy lifting. And when we do something to kill those, like we let the tree go dry or we overwater, we have to wait for those to come back for things to start achieving their balance again. So like the sign of overwatering quite often looks like the same thing. If you're reading the leaves, you'll see the same thing as having water of certain deficiencies. And that's what you're seeing, because the roots are so deficient, they're not taking up stuff. And so you're seeing all those vitamin deficiencies. And so if you're literal about that, you'll start adding those vitamins when really it's root damage. All right, I appreciate you. Frida Reba Darcy appreciates you. This was some information that I had originally done a deep dive on. I have done several deep dives in the past because I had growing in horticulture in several different facets have been a fascination of mine ever since I was a child. And whenever I learned to grow something weird, like now bonsai is the weird thing I'm growing as a 10-year-old. I think it was Venus flytraps and carnivorous plants, and then later orchids, and then and I always had different substrate challenges, like pitcher plants, and those like grow in some pretty toxic water, some pretty stagnant, boggy like conditions. For example, and I had to learn about that. It just didn't seem right to me. I was finding those growing wild, and I would find them growing in the places that seemed the most least hospitable, in the stinky water and fields that didn't drain well. So over the years, I've done deep dives on soils, and I decided that whenever I had questions about people deciding to go all out, and maybe, you know, why would I just use clay whenever I can go buy some really nice potting soil? There's reasons why we use clay pellets, and there's reasons why potting soil is not necessarily the great gainer that we think it is in when it comes to trees that are going to be in that soil for over 8 or 9 months. I appreciate you, Frida. Appreciate you. And our next drop will be Sunday when we do our next drop. We'll do something beautiful out here on the balcony. We've had some pretty warm weather the last couple of days, but I won't complain. And thank you all so much for needed more coffee. Yeah.